to the Smart Property Investment Show with your host, Phil Tarrant.
G'day everyone, welcome to the show. Thanks for tuning in. Phil Tarrant here, property investor and also editor of Smart Property Investment. I'm joined by my regular co-host, Vivian Kelly. Vivian, how you going?
I'm good, Phil. How are you?
I'm not too bad at all. Just getting on with stuff as we always do. Lots of things happening in the world of smart property investment at the moment. I hope you've all checked out the new and improved website, smartpropertyinvestment.com.au. What we've done, we've listened to a lot of reader feedback and listener feedback actually with the podcast, and we've shifted a lot of our focus to not only our portfolio, but a lot of the information that we're able to glean from all these great podcasts that we're doing today. So we like the stories, don't we, Viv?
We do.
If you have a story, get in contact with us because we'd love to show the rest of Australia how you're going about building wealth through property, which we're massive advocates of. Building wealth through property, it is key, but there's a lot of moving parts to it. One of it is that you need to make sure that you've got someone in your property giving you rent to help pay the mortgage. So our theme for today, and I thought it's a good one, we've got Lisa in. Lisa's in from Let's Rent. Lisa, how you going?
I'm great, thank you, Phil.
So you're a property manager. Now, we were chatting off air quickly, and I said, so you're just like every other property manager, and you said, no, you're not. You're different.
That's right.
In a different way, which I quite like. I found refreshing. The conversation was around a lot of people view property management just as a commodity, as an afterthought for a lot of people once they buy an investment property, because it's exciting when you buy a place and think about all the money you're going to make out of it, but if you haven't got people in there renting it, you're probably going to be in trouble at some point soon.
Absolutely.
Tell us a little bit about Let's Rent. What do you guys do and how do you do it?
Yeah, well, we are specialists in the field. One of the things that we specifically look for is risk. So what risks are landlords exposed to? You mentioned having the rent coming in. So we have, as of Friday, we have 99.57% of our tenants in advance. So one of the major things we take care of is ensuring that tenants do pay on time, do pay in advance, and all of our systems and procedures are set up to do that. Vacancy, again, a major cost for a client, so we want to make sure we're preparing for that well in advance. So we're contacting tenants about 2 months prior to the lease expiring and asking if they would like to stay on, and asking the landlord the same question, so that we're not getting to the end of the lease and suddenly the tenant gives us 14 days notice, which is inevitably going to create vacancy.
Interesting. The world of property investment, as I said beforehand, a lot of people see the actual renting of their property as a bit of an afterthought, and they just expect that as a property investor that someone's going to be in there helping to pay the mortgage. There must be a lot of horror stories you hear and see in property management land of things going absolutely wrong. How much of the time do you think the problems that property investors have are associated with just poor administration or poor knowledge or poor education around how property management works versus the property not being managed properly by a property manager?
Well, I think it's the property manager's responsibility to educate the landlord, firstly. So that's what we are there for. So the landlord isn't necessarily an expert in that space. So if you have a landlord who is wanting to rent their property out with unrealistic expectations of the pricing, then it's up to us to demonstrate to that client why we feel that that is the case. So clearly we would set up, comparables and explain, why we feel their property is related to these other properties and why the pricing would be lower than perhaps their expectations. There is also poor administration from property management as well, such as the example I gave earlier, in that if you are not monitoring what's happening with the tenant as they're coming up to the lease expiry, the owner is absolutely exposed to a situation where they could be losing money. So the property manager has a major role to play in ensuring that the landlord achieves the best result out of that investment.
So it's like continuity of rent. It's
Yes.
understanding the time in which a lease will expire and preparing and planning around that. I guess you guys have a tough job. I don't manage any of my properties myself. I use property managers, and
That's a good thing.
I'm a big advocate of it.
I don't manage mine either, by the way.
Which is good. The reason why I do it is I don't want to do it, number one.
Yeah.
I'm happy to pay, call it a premium. I'm happy to pay the fee for someone else to manage it for me. I don't want to be called out on weekends to fix leaking taps. I don't want to actually have to deal with tenants to chase them for their rent. I'm happy to pay for someone to do that for me, and I see a lot of value in it. A lot of people still think they can manage their own properties, and the stories I hear is that people go down that path and they often turn back to a property manager because it just turns into a massive headache. But not to cut you guys out of business, if you wanted to manage your property by yourself, the whole establishment of what I can rent a property out for, what are the ways in which people can establish a reasonable rent? And a reasonable rent being someone's happy to pay that, and that's the rent you're happy to receive, but someone who's going to stay in that stay as a tenant long term in that property. What's the best mechanisms? What's the steps to go through to establishing what can I rent a property out for?
Well, I think if you're a landlord who wants to manage the property yourself, you have to educate yourself. So the best way to do that is to go and look at other properties that you consider to be comparable and try and look at it objectively as to what your property offers in comparison to those properties. So that's essentially what we do on a very large number basis. So, we're looking at properties all day, every day. We're renting in different areas. So we have that experience, in-house. But a landlord can go out and do that. In terms of maintaining tenancies and keeping tenants longer term, if you do price that property slightly below market, you are much more likely to keep that tenant in the long term, and it's much cheaper to do that as well, particularly if you find a good tenant.
Lisa, you're obviously an advocate of having tenants on leases where you can, and you were saying that at Let's Rent you have a very high proportion of your clients who have leases sort of set in stone. But I've been contacted a lot by investors lately who in certain parts of Australia have been really struggling to tie their tenants into a lease. The tenants want that flexibility. They want the rolling lease. What's your advice to those investors? How can they convince the tenants to sign on the dotted line?
Well, there's a number of ways we do it. Having said that, you do have to take into consideration the market conditions in each area. And I certainly know there are areas, around Australia that it's quite difficult to maintain tenancies. But in our case, contacting the tenant early is key so that you can actually manage that process, encouraging the tenant that if they sign the lease, then they're securing that same rent for the next 12 months. And the landlord has a right to have the tenant on a lease. So there's actually insurance policies out there that don't cover the landlord if the tenant is on a rolling lease. So we often mention that as being a reason for the landlord wanting the tenant to be on a lease. I mean, out of our tenancies, we have about 87% on fixed leases. So we actively do push for that because clearly, again, in terms of a risk factor, we really don't want a tenant giving 21 days notice as we come up to Christmas.
Sure.
So if I walked into your office and looked at a moment in time, you would have people who are getting their leases renewed. You'd have new properties coming on the marketplace and you're looking to find tenants for them. What's your process, or did you have a tick list or whatever that says when we receive applications? Because some properties, I imagine you get 20, 30, 40, 50 applications for, depending on the time. Sometimes you get a handful. How do you go about working out who is the right tenant for a property? What are the major things you should look at when someone applies to choose this person over this person?
Obviously, reference checking is crucially important.
From previous landlords?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes. And in saying that, a tenant who is renting a property directly through the landlord is not as good a reference as someone who is renting through an agency who can demonstrate a ledger that shows when they paid their rent. So, look, the first thing I look at is the stability of the application. In other words, how long have they been in their employment? How long have they been in their previous rental? How long have they known their referees? So that's the first check. Obviously, we need to ensure that their salary is sufficient to pay the rent, which is key to get to the next step. And then, of course, there is that reference checking process. Now, we don't approve any application without a copy of the ledger because there's many agents out there that believe that tenants are paying on time, but they're not. So it's very common for us to receive a ledger where the agent has said, yeah, the tenant's paid on time all the way through that tenancy. And in fact, the tenant has been up to 14 days in arrears.
Okay.
So that's why we do that check.
And in terms of salaries, so what's your number or metric for saying this is how much the property's worth a week and this is how much net income they bring into the household? What's the number?
Look, it's around 40%, which might sound very high, but with the demographic that we're dealing with, they often have investment properties as well. They may have share portfolios, so you can't look at it in isolation. Additionally, if someone is self-employed, it is likely that their salary will not show as high as the reality of their income actually is. So they'll put a lot of their expenses through the business. Is
it a difficult process sometimes? You sit there and say, look, there's two great potential tenants here and you could put them both in there. What would elevate someone over another? If if this person wants a dog, you'd say, well, I want to put a dog on property, you don't allow it. Or this person here, if there's two incomes versus one income, if you say, for example, you have a couple and the wife earns a hell of a lot of money and the husband might be a stay-at-home dad versus two people who are both professionals. How do you marry up that choice? And I imagine it's quite difficult.
It's not generally difficult because there are usually, like I said to you, the stability of that applicant is really important. Because you'll find that if they are in their employment for, let's say, 5 years, they've been in their previous rental for 3 years, they've known their personal referee for 15 to 20 years, they're likely to be a long-term tenant, unless they are saying that they're just looking to rent until they purchase a property, and that way we might, put them aside to some extent. The other thing is talking to these people is really important because you can see so much on an application, but what about how the person responds to communication? Are they easy to communicate with? Are they difficult? That often shows up quite early.
Yeah.
So if we're contacting them, for example, we can't get hold of one of the referees, so we need their assistance to get the application checked. If they're very responsive to that, then again, that's a good sign. If they, can't be bothered dealing with us, then again...
It shows an indicator they're going to be easy to communicate with.
Yeah, or they're not that interested in the property. So talking to the applicant is really important during that process, but also talking to them at the property so that we're gauging what sort of person they are. Are they going to be great tenants, or are they going to be walking through the door and pointing out, every single little thing that needs to be done to bring it up to brand new?
Interesting. And do you think that the tenants who get their application in the earliest are typically the best tenants? So they're obviously the keenest, but I imagine that will help you get a really good indicator of whether or not your pricing of the rent is about right. So if you get a flood of applications in, you probably think, okay, we've priced this right. If you don't get a lot of applications in, you probably need to revise the pricing. And that's just sort of a very fluid thing that you just let roll.
It is, because the reality is that from one weekend to the next, or one day to the next, there are a fixed number of people in the rental market looking to move within a short space of time. So we only have, I would say, 3 weeks maximum to find a tenant.
Okay.
So we're coaching our clients through that each time we show the property. What is the feedback? How many people have we had through? We look at the number of inquiries we have through on each property as well. So we use a backup system, which I'm sure you're aware of, called Inspect Real Estate. So that gives us a lot of transparency in terms of, how the property is actually tracking in the marketplace. And it is pretty quiet out there at the moment. So as you had said, we're not getting applications in quickly. When the market's hot, the applications come in thick and fast.
It's so funny
at the
though.
moment.
You pick up any paper on a Saturday or Sunday and they'll tell you that it's madness trying to rent a property, that it's really hard to rent, it's impossible to rent a property. But often it's not the reality. There might be one very, very small pocket where there is a high demand, but everyone else is just struggling to get tenants in.
Correct. I think it's complete rubbish. The fact is there is not one rental market. There are a number of different, an infinite number of rental markets because, what is comparing to let's say a 2-bed, 1-bath, 1 parking in Balmain in average condition. Well, how many of those properties are currently available in the marketplace? How many tenants are there? Is a different marketplace to a 4-bedder at $1,800 a week in Redfern.
We sort of write a little bit about this, Viv, don't we, about sort of constant inspections of your property. So your property manager should be ensuring that your place isn't getting trashed or inappropriate things are happening in the property or someone's built a drug lab or whatever it is, right? We get these things all the time. So that's an expectation of part of the payment, part of the premium that you're paying appointing a property manager to look after your property is that component. For people who choose not to use a property manager and try and self-manage, what would your recommendation be on the frequency of inspections? Like how often legally are you able to go in there and check out your property, make sure everything's okay? Or what is sort of best practice, do you think?
In New South Wales, 4 times.
4 times a year?
Yep, that's right. If you are self-managing, I think it depends on your contact with the tenant. For example, if your tenant is reporting a lot of repairs to you, that's a good reason to inspect the property. If the tenant is saying nothing at all, it's even more reason to inspect the property. Because if a tenant is saying nothing, there's a number of different reasons why they might be saying nothing. A lot of tenants don't even notice, for example, when there's a stain on the ceiling or if the tap is dripping. So it's important that you do check in on those tenants and make sure that your property is in good order, because the other reason for tenants not contacting is perhaps there's more people living in the property than is permitted.
Okay, interesting.
So speaking of property inspections, Lisa, Do you have any horror stories from the road of times you've gone to check out a property and you've found something you weren't too thrilled with?
Oh, we did have a dead body last year.
Oh, wow.
So, yes, it's fun and games, isn't it? Yeah, so that's the first time that's ever happened in my agency, and we managed the situation. It was, obviously a very sad situation. That person passed away unexpectedly, and my property manager did open the door to find the body there. So we needed to counsel her as well as take the owner through the process that we needed to go through.
I guess that's another reason for property managers, isn't it? Because if you were self-managing, you really wouldn't know what on earth to do in that situation.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. And fortunately, we encourage all of our clients to have landlord insurance. And in fact, I wrote about this in one of my monthly emails last year before this happened. And the fact is that this can happen. Now, what does that mean in terms of costs? If you're not insured, and you're having to pay all of those costs yourself, it's thousands and thousands of dollars. In this case, it was a one-bedroom apartment, and the total cost was about $7,000.
Wow.
Covered by insurance.
It adds up, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
Definitely adds up.
So it's madness not to have insurance because you never know when something out of the ordinary might happen.
Tough one. So pets or no pets in apartments?
Good tenants or bad tenants?
Both. What do you reckon? Because legislation's changing, right? So it's going to get to a point where a body corporate needs to give just cause why someone shouldn't have a pet rather than them giving cause why they should have one. Is that pretty much where it's heading?
It is. Well, look, the Tenants Union put forward in the last review of the Residential Tenancies Act that all tenants should be given the right to have a pet. However, we had a meeting with them at the REI a few weeks ago, which was very useful. Yeah. And I think it was very important for both parties to come together to discuss that issue amongst others. The owner should have the right to refuse pets. It is a risk factor. And I don't mind if tenants have pets if they have a good tenancy history and I can prove that to the client, then I'm very happy to put a tenant in with a pet. But a lot of landlords have had very poor experience with landlords with pets, and clearly they want to protect their properties against any damage.
So do you think it'll be legislated at any point that pets can go into any property?
At this stage, no.
Okay.
I think that there is a very strong argument for the landlord not to be forced to allow tenants with pets, because there has to be a mechanism to protect the owner in respect of, flea treatments, carpet cleaning and all that sort of thing. So, there has to be a permission process.
Which I think is fair and reasonable, but taking legislation aside, people with pets can be very good tenants. So
Absolutely.
In terms of longevity, continuity of lease, getting long-term tenants in, having someone with a pet in there can be a real positive.
It can, as long as you have the reference checking to support that. I have absolutely no issue with tenants with pets. In fact, they're often fantastic. So it's not really about the pet itself, it's about how the tenant takes care of the pet, and that comes through with that reference checking.
So what happens when all goes wrong? So the fear of, a couple of fears that an investor has. Number one is that your tenants smash up your place and ruin it. That's one thing, and insurance can cover that.
Yeah, malicious damage, yes.
The thing is that, people say to me, as a property investor, aren't you scared that people are going to wreck your property? I say, that's fine, it's insured. I haven't got a problem. If they wreck the kitchen.
I
prefer they don't.
I prefer they don't, because it's a real hassle in terms of time and going through insurance process, but that's not a big issue. The major issue that a investor has is that their rent doesn't get paid. So obviously if you have the relevant insurance, you're covered for a period of time without receiving the rent. There is a lot of rigmarole associated with trying to get that rent back based on insurance, but many times you end up in a tribunal situation. If you go for a period of time without anyone paying your rent, you still need to pay your mortgage, so you need to ensure that you have a buffer or some level of capacity to be able to continue to pay your mortgage.
I would agree with that, yes.
And that's absolutely essential. But putting that aside and saying you need to get someone out of your property because they are just not paying the rent, legislation seems to tend to favour the person renting the property for a period of time. So the landlord needs to go through hoops, jump through hoops many times to actually...
Yeah, I would actually say the change in the legislation in 2010 moved towards the landlord's favour. It was probably the only piece of legislation that did. And that is that if the tenant is 15 days in arrears, our process is to deliver a termination notice, because we don't have to wait however many days for the postage, and apply for tribunal at the same time.
After 15 days?
No.
Okay.
Well, on the 15th day, if the tenant still hasn't paid their rent, then we apply for tribunal and deliver the termination notice at the same time. In other words, we mean business.
Okay.
You have to pay your rent. It's not an option. So if the rent is not then paid within that 14-day period, on the 15th day we're in tribunal asking for an eviction.
Okay, so typically if someone pays their rent during that period, everything's okay and they just go back to paying their rent as per usual, but a bit of a black mark against them in terms of whether or not you'd want to renew their lease at that point in time.
Of course. My experience is that things can go wrong in people's lives, and unfortunately that's probably an area where you know that something has gone wrong if they've been good tenants previously, and it may be that unfortunately their life is completely off track. I had to do an eviction earlier this year and I worked with the tenant to facilitate that. So again, it's not a black and white situation. It is when you get to tribunal, but in this case, unfortunately, his business had failed. So he was trying to travel between here and the States to sort it out. We applied to tribunal. We went through that process. He was in the States at the time the eviction was going to occur. So I managed to get him to pay 10 more days rent so that we could push the eviction out a little bit further. And then he handed the property back at that point in time without us having to get the sheriff there.
Okay, so that was a good outcome for all, I imagine. As good as you can get.
As good as you can get in a scenario where someone is in a very bad situation. Yeah.
Let's just say if it ends up in tribunal, this can be a very timely and costly exercise to actually take someone to tribunal. So would your recommendation be try to avoid tribunal and be collaborative and look at the situation that you just explained in that scenario where you try and get a good outcome for everyone. But if you end up in tribunal, can you chat us through that process? Because I think a lot of investors don't actually understand what happens at that point and what the next steps are.
This is probably the only scenarios where you will get to tribunal and actually have the case heard the first time you're at tribunal. So, as I said, the legislation is actually in the landlord's favour in this respect. Once you get to tribunal on that 15th day, so the tenant is likely to be, about 28 days in arrears, 29 days in arrears at that point in time, then you will get an eviction notice in the vast majority of cases. So you can protect the landlord's interests at that point in time.
Okay.
It is important to always negotiate because we don't want to escalate a situation where it's not necessary. In other cases where we are going to tribunal, let's say for other situations, let's say there's mould in a property or the tenant is claiming that the landlord should give them a rent reduction because there's a leak in the ceiling and it's gone on for 5 days or whatever it is, then it's going to be a much more drawn out process. So you'll get to the first hearing, you'll conciliate. If you don't reach agreement, then it will be put aside for hearing, which is usually about 5 weeks later. Okay. And then both parties have the opportunity to present evidence in triplicate, one to each party and the other to the tribunal themselves.
But in those situations, Lisa, where it's not rental arrears, is your advice to sort of try and avoid tribunal where possible?
At all costs, yes. Because once you get to tribunal, the decision is out of your hands. Because it's likely that if you have not been able to conciliate and reach agreement at the first hearing, the other party is going to take it all the way through to the hearing, in which case you have a member who is going to decide, who is more than likely going to decide in the tenant's favour. They will err on the tenant's side, definitely.
So in that case, if it's not arrears, if it's just we have a difference of opinion, a lot of the time they'll find in the tenant's favour versus the landlord.
Correct. That's my experience.
Yeah, that's what I hear anecdotally from everyone I speak to.
And I'm a chapter member at the REI. That is every single chapter member's experience.
It's tough.
Yes, it's extremely tough.
And in many times, when you hear these things, you listen to both sides of the from both parties, and often it's just the most mediocre, tiny little thing. Something, that the stairway got flooded, so I couldn't use the stairs and I had to use the back entrance or something like it. Sometimes it's often so small.
Yeah, and to the average person on the street, it seems quite reasonable that stuff happens and you kind of have to get on with life. Whereas there is definitely an attitude with the advice that tenants are receiving that they are entitled to compensation at every point. So I'll give you an example of a case that we didn't take to tribunal, that we negotiated very hard to avoid tribunal. So the shower was leaking, the ensuite shower was leaking into a common stairwell.
Okay.
It was a strata repair. The tenant was given an option to receive an abatement commitment of, I think it was about $300. The job was going to take about 10 working days. She decided to move out and moved into accommodation at $220 per night. And she was claiming $2,800 by the time we got to the point where the shower was completed. So I said to the owner, you do not want to go to tribunal on this. I know what we think is fair. However, if you have to pay our cost to go to tribunal and the outcome is put in the hands of the member, he may well award the $2,800 because she had a medical condition that she felt required her to vacate the premises. She did also say that she didn't want to share the bathroom with the other tenants. But whether that would hold up in tribunal is questionable. So we did settle for $1,000 in the end.
Okay. What happens there? So that person's lease comes up for renewal and you just say, we're not renewing your lease?
Well, that would be considered a bad move because you cannot retaliate. So if you said to the tenant, we're not renewing your lease, then the tenant could say, well, that's retaliation for the compensation that the client had to pay when the bathroom was fixed.
So how do you navigate that then?
Very carefully, very carefully. So the owner may choose to put the rent up. So we'd be happy for you to, the owner would be delighted if you signed another 12-month lease. However, we've looked at the market and the market would justify an increase of perhaps $50 a week. So you might set that at a point where you feel that the tenant might not stay on.
Okay.
Justifiably in the marketplace though, and you can never increase the rent beyond that, but it would be likely in this particular situation that we could potentially justify certainly a $30 increase.
So if you're a self-manager of your property, or even if you use property managers, and your property manager might say, look, we recommend that you should be putting the rent up because of these particular factors, or if you're managing, you might have it under market value and you could probably, eke a few more dollars out of it. What's the maximum you can increase the rent of an investment property at any period in time? There's no maximum. There's no maximum. So as long as you can, so if you can justify that I've increased this for this particular reason to hit market value.
Correct.
That's fine. What can a tenant say in response to that? Can they say that's unreasonable?
Yes, they can. And then their only way of presenting or winning a case like that would be to take it to tribunal and prove that the increase is beyond the market.
Okay. So what you do is you end up with two different points, two different numbers, and traditionally you probably meet somewhere in the middle and say, let's do this. If you want to hold on to the tenant or if you're happy that you can find someone else. So you can't start marketing that property while you're having that conversation for a new tenant at a new rate?
No.
You can't do that?
No.
So you need to wait until a tenant you've notified them that this tenancy is coming to an end effective of this date, and once you've given them that notification, you can start marketing the property at a new rate.
Well, you would have to give them a termination notice.
Okay.
So if you're coming up towards the end of the lease, which is why we start
2 months beforehand,
so that we have time to get the tenant in. I mean, it takes such a long time at times to get the tenant actually to come into the office to sign the lease. I've been chasing one for about 3 weeks now. This is a tenant in Paddington, and there's all sorts of things that has been going on in their lives that mean that they can't make 4 appointments.
Yeah.
So hopefully they're there at the moment.
Does that make you nervous though? Do you think,
no,
they don't seem to be very organised?
No, because I've already explained to the client what the strategy is. If they are not in the office today, we will issue them with a 30-day termination, and we will offer to rescind that 30-day termination if the lease is signed by Wednesday.
Okay, tools of the trade.
Always plan ahead.
That's good. I think we've run out of time. This is an important topic, so I think we should chat about it again at some point.
I'd love to.
My outtakes of this, a couple of points. Number one, that 2 months prior to a lease term running out to renew it makes a lot of sense. So whether you're self-managing or use a good property manager, you should be looking for that. If your property manager's not doing that, you should be chasing them up. And if they're not doing that, maybe it's time to find a new property manager.
So it's a great question to ask when you're choosing a property manager, what percentage of your tenancies are on a lease? Because it's a really good indication as to how they treat that process.
Interesting. Point number two, understand or be aware of the tribunal process and try not to go to tribunal if you can avoid it. It might mean some negotiation with your tenants and taking high ground a lot of times. So understand that it's probably not the best course of action a lot of the times if you just want to keep costs down and keep continuity of tenancy.
Yes.
I think that's a really good point as well. So there's sort of two key things I'd probably take out of that.
Yeah, and also just Lisa's comments about doing those background checks on tenants and, looking at numbers as well as the personality. Have they been paying on time? Can they afford it? And how communicative are they with you?
Good. Thanks for coming in, Lisa.
Thank you very much
I
for
really
having me.
appreciate it. It's good. Viv, thanks again.
Thanks, Phil.
It was a pleasure. Remember to check out smartpropertyinvestment.com.au. We're also on all the social pages, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. You can follow me on Twitter if you like, at Philip Tarrant. If you want to ask me and Viv any questions, then there's heaps coming in. I think we're going to have to do a
There are too
Q&A
many
thing.
coming in, Phil. I haven't had a chance to respond to them yet, so apologies to everyone. I have received them, I have filed them away, and I will get back to you.
So what we're going to do, guys, is some of the stuff we can answer. Some of it is much better for getting some experts to answer, including Lisa. Thanks for putting your hand up
You're welcome.
on the property matter stuff. But what we'll do, we'll get it up all online, guys, all the detailed responses to all these questions. Then we'll also cover it in a special show coming up as well, where we'll just run through sort of the Q&As and some of the ways in which you can respond to different situations or circumstances. Contacted us, editor at Smart Property Investment, if there's anything that you want to add to that list. And we'll see you soon. Thanks for tuning in. Goodbye.